Hello everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you guys my end of August wrap up. So I actually have mostly 5-star books to talk about today, but I also have a couple of books, one that I DNF'd and a couple of others that I didn't like so much. So there's definitely quite a mixed bag with this wrap up. So I am going to be discussing all of the books that I read in the last 2 weeks or so of August. If you want to hear my thoughts about all of the books that I read in the first half of the month, I will link my mid-month wrap up in the cards above. So without further ado, let's just get into it. The first book I want to talk about real quick is the one book that I DNF'd, meaning the book that I did not finish, and that was Reborn Yesterday by Tessa Bailey. So I thought I was going to love this book because I've really enjoyed the books by Tessa Bailey that I have read. I've read both of her books in her Hot and Hammered series that she has been publishing with Avon. The first book in that series was Fix Her Up and the second book was Love Her or Lose Her. Really enjoyed both of those books. And then I saw that she was self-publishing this book, and apparently this is going to be the first book of a vampire romance, paranormal romance series. And turns out I only made it 28% through the book before I just had to put it down. For one thing, I just couldn't really connect with the characters at all. I'll tell you about the plot real quick. It's about this human Ginny and this vampire Jonas. Ginny is like a mortician and she has this beautiful, gorgeous guy on her table, like she's ready to like embalm this dude, but then all of a sudden he wakes up and he's like, I'm a vampire, and their relationship kind of starts from there. Yeah, so like I said, I couldn't really connect with the characters for some reason. Like, Ginny is 25 and of course Jonas is a lot older because he's a vampire, but Ginny's character especially felt like around like Bella's age from the Twilight series, just very immature, very much a teenager. So yeah, unfortunately this book just didn't work for me. The next book I want to talk about is Bookish and the Beast by Ashley Poston. This is an arc that I got off of NetGalley, and this is the third book in her Once Upon a Con series, which is a YA contemporary series that is based around the idea of fairy tale retellings. And as you can tell, this is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. The first book of this series, Geekerella, which is based off of Cinderella, was my favorite book of the series. I gave that one 5 stars. I absolutely adored it, and I highly recommend this series overall, but unfortunately this third and what I think is the final book did disappoint me a bit. I did end up giving it 3 stars. It was just very lackluster. So if you don't know what this Once Upon a Con series is about, it essentially centers around this Starfield fandom, which is a TV show that reminds me a lot of Star Trek and kind of Star Wars in a way. And there's also this ExcelsiCon, which is like a Comic-Con for Starfield fans specifically. And in this third book, we have our 2 main characters. One of them is Vance, who is an actor in the Starfield reboot movies that are happening while this series is going on, and then we have Rosie, who is just like a normal teenage girl, and so it's their romance. It's very much like an enemies to lovers situation. And yeah, I liked the characters that Poston came up with, but I just felt like the execution wasn't great. And if you're going to do a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, I really expect you to bring it because it's one of my personal favorite fairy tales. I love reading retellings and I want them to be great, and unfortunately this one just wasn't. So I don't really recommend this one, but I do recommend the first 2 books of this series, which, like I said, Geekerella is the first book, and then The Princess and the Fangirl was also really great. Next book I want to discuss is The Night Swim by Megan Golden. This is a true crime thriller novel, and it centers around this woman, Rachel. She is the host of a very popular true crime podcast, and so she is starting, like, I think the 3rd season of this podcast at this point, and she is following this rape trial that is happening in this really small town. I think it's called Neapolis. It's like a coastal, I think East Coast, like around North Carolina or something like that, I want to say. And so while she's covering this trial, there's also this woman, Hannah, who keeps mysteriously communicating with her via letters that she either like leaves on her car windshield or outside of her hotel room door. And she's trying to get Rachel to help her with this murder cold case that happened 25 years earlier in this same town. Basically, Hannah's older sister, Jenny, died 25 years earlier from what they ruled as a drowning, but there were very weird and suspicious circumstances going on, and there was also a lot of cover-up going on with the police department, and so Hannah is desperately trying to get Rachel to investigate this herself and to try to get answers for her. So we have Rachel being kind of pulled in different directions, trying to kind of solve both cases, both this rape case and this murder case, and it was really interesting. I ended up giving this 4 stars. It was a really solid true crime thriller. If you like courtroom trials and things like that, I think you'll really love this. I also loved the incorporation of her podcast. Basically in between chapters of the main narrative, there would be excerpts from her podcast when she was covering this rape trial and things like that. So I thought that was really interesting. I will say this wasn't the most shocking thriller that I've ever read, which is why I gave it 4 stars and not a higher rating. Also, huge content warning, of course, for not only sexual assault and rape, but murder as well, so definitely be aware of that before going into this book. Next up, I want to talk about A Torch Against the Night by Sabaa Tahir. This is book 2 in the In the Ember and in the Ashes series. I don't really have a lot to say about this book. I also can't really talk about the plot, of course, because it is the sequel to the first book, but just to tell you a very basic premise of this series, if you don't already know, this is a very popular YA fantasy series, but it centers around Laia and Elias. So in this world, there's the Martial Empire. They rule over everybody in this whole kingdom. And Laia is a scholar, which is essentially a minority group within this empire, and so they're all treated very poorly. A lot of them are slaves for the Martial Empire. And so Laia's brother is found out to be working for the resistance that is trying to overthrow the Martial Empire, and so he gets taken in by the Empire, and she ends up working undercover as a slave to try to save him. And then Elias is one of like the top soldiers at this military academy that is run by the Martial Empire, and their paths end up crossing and the plot goes on from there. I thought this was a very solid sequel. I don't have a lot of strong opinions about this series so far. I gave it 4 stars. It's a solid book, it's a solid series, but as of right now, it's not anything that's truly blowing me away. I mean, I like the characters, I like where the story is going, but I don't particularly love anything about this series. So I'm hoping that the 3rd book, which is A Reaper at the Gates, really steps things up, and then the 4th book, which is like A Sky Against the Storm or something like that, that's coming out in December. So I really hope that those 2 books really step things up. All right, next I want to discuss another arc that I got off of NetGalley. This is The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. This is quite a different book from what I usually read. This is sci-fi, and it also has to do with a multiverse, so it's a world that has like hundreds of different parallel worlds. So our main character is Kara. She is, I think they're called traversers, and she works for this very high-tech company. This company kind of reminds me of like Elon Musk and SpaceX kind of thing. And so we've got this man in this one Earth that Kara is based in, and he has invented the ability to travel between all of these parallel worlds. And so Kara travels between all of these different Earths to essentially gather data for what they call Earth Zero, which is the Earth that invented this technology. She also has her supervisor, whose name is Dell, and one of the things that is amazing about this novel is just how diverse it is. So Kara, she is Black and bisexual. Dell, I believe, is Asian. I can't remember specifically what heritage she has, but most of the characters in this book are people of color, which I really appreciated. So I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed this, and going into it, I didn't really know what to expect because, like I said, I don't read a lot of books like this. I don't read a ton of sci-fi, and I don't think I've ever read a book that centers around a multiverse kind of idea, but I thought that it was done so well. From page 1, I was really intrigued by Kara's character. Like I said, she's our main character, but then the main plot kicked in and I was just literally on the edge of my seat the entire time until the very ending, because there were so many twists and turns. I just had no idea what was going to happen next, and it's just a really well-paced novel. I love reading books like this, so I definitely recommend it. Kara is such a cool and interesting amazing character. She's also very flawed and just feels very real, and I also just love reading about characters like that. Also, really quick, I did want to add that there is a content warning for this book that I haven't seen a lot of other people talk about in their reviews. There is physical abuse and domestic violence. That doesn't necessarily take place on the page, but it is discussed quite a bit, so I would be aware of that before going into this book. So all of the other books I'm going to talk about in this video are all 5-star reads, which is just amazing. So the first one I want to discuss is The Black Kids by Christina Hammonds Reed. This is also another ARC that I got off of NetGalley, which is so exciting because leading up to the release of this book was already such a big deal because people were comparing it to books such as The Hate You Give and Dear Martin by Nick Stone and things like that. So I was so pumped to read this, and this book definitely did not disappoint. So just to give you a little bit of the plot, we are centering around our main character, Ashley. She is a black teenage girl in LA in 1992. And so she lives a very privileged lifestyle in Los Angeles. She goes to a private school that is predominantly white, and I think she also lives in a predominantly white neighborhood. But then the beating of Rodney King happens in 1992, which of course was a very major event of that year, not only in Los Angeles, but of course around the country. It's kind of difficult to describe what the plot of this book is, but I would say that it really centers around Ashley kind of coming to terms with her blackness and, I don't know, kind of coming to terms with these events that are happening around her. At first, she doesn't really have much of a reaction because, like I said, she has a very privileged life, and so she feels very much separated from what is going on surrounding Rodney King and all of that. She doesn't really have any black friends. A lot of her friends are the white kids that go to the private school that she attends, and they are very toxic people. They are not great friends. But what I really loved about this book was Ashley's character. She is very flawed. She also says and does things throughout this book that are very problematic. But she also just feels very real and authentic, and I also really enjoyed Reed's writing style. I just thought that she just did this novel so well. I wholeheartedly recommend this book if you are a fan of authors like Angie Thomas, Nick Stone. So yeah, I thought that this book was fantastic and I highly recommend it. All right, next up, I read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And so this is kind of a follow-up to his other book, which is Stamped from the Beginning, which is more of a historical resource. I talked about that book in my mid-month wrap-up for August. Like I said, that's already linked up in the cards above. This one is obviously about how to be an anti-racist, and he covers so many different topics surrounding this idea. What I loved about this book was that he wasn't just telling the reader how to be an anti-racist, he was also walking us through his own journey to becoming an anti-racist. He talks a lot about his own internalized racism, colorism, things like that. Something that was so memorable about this book for me was he would really spell out, you can't be an anti-racist if you're blank. And one of them was like, you can't be an anti-racist if you're homophobic, because obviously there are people of all races that are LGBTQ+. So if you're homophobic, you're racist. You know, he also says that you can't be anti-racist if you are sexist, because obviously there are people of all races that are women or non-binary or transgender or things like that. And I thought that that was really powerful. I think that this is just a fantastic resource if you were trying to educate yourself about social and racial issues in this country in general. It's just, yeah, it's a fantastic book. But I would recommend reading either Stamped or Stamped from the Beginning. Stamped is the YA version of Stamped from the Beginning, because I think that it gives you a lot of very useful context before going into this book. All right, next 5-star read we have is Destiny's Embrace by Beverly Jenkins. I did it, guys. I finally read a Beverly Jenkins novel, and I absolutely adored it. So this is book 1 in her Destiny trilogy, I think it's called, and it centers around these 3 brothers. This first one is about Logan. He essentially lives on this farm with his stepmother, but they have a very close relationship. And this woman, Mariah Cooper, she ends up moving to California where their farm is. From Philadelphia, she actually has a very abusive mother that she's been dealing with her whole life, and so she finally decides decides to leave and move to California when she gets a job as a housekeeper for Logan. And so when she gets to the farm, it very quickly turns into like an enemies to lover situation because Mariah and Logan disagree on literally everything. But this was just, it was so good. I loved how organically their relationship changed from enemies to lovers throughout. I also adored Mariah's character arc because at the very beginning of this book, she is very quiet, meek, scared because of how abusive her mother is to her, but then after she moves to California, she really finds her voice, and that's mainly because of Logan. He kind of motivates her to stand up for herself, and I don't know, it's just really fantastic. This book also gave me butterflies and had me swooning at some point, so I highly recommend this book, and I cannot wait to read the other 2 books in this series very soon. Next up, I have You Deserve Each Other by Sarah Hogle. So this is essentially an lovers to enemies to lovers romance. It's a second chance romance between Nick and Naomi. They are engaged at the very beginning of this book, and they come to kind of despise each other over the course of their relationship. And so this book is all about them finding their way back to one another, and that is my absolute favorite trope in romance ever I have discovered. I think the main reason I gave this 5 stars was because of just how funny it was to me. I will say this has a very kind of ridiculous sense of humor. In that way, it kind of reminds me of like the Bromance Book Club and Undercover Bromance. And I know that that sense of humor doesn't jive with everybody. But yeah, to kind of go back to the humor, I adored Nick's parents and like the role that they played in Nick and Naomi's relationship, because especially his mother, Deborah, like she is a lot, and seeing Naomi like kind of pull pranks on her and kind of I don't know, pull the wool out from under her. Is that how the saying goes? I don't know. That was really entertaining. And then like eventually both Nick and Naomi kind of start pulling pranks on her. And like, I just loved that so much. I know a lot of people viewed that to be very stupid and immature, which I also understand. But yeah, this book just really worked for me. I will say I wish that there would have been like a short little epilogue at the end so that we would have gotten a clear picture of what happens after Nick and Naomi get married. This book was amazing. I could definitely see myself reread this over and over again because it just made me so happy. Alright guys, we have one more book to talk about, and that is House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. This is book 1 in her Crescent City series, which is her very first adult fantasy series. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this plot. This takes place in a very modern and high-tech urban fantasy world. It's a very interesting world. We have our main character, Bryce, and she's kind of a party girl. She's just living her life. She's half fae, half human. And then one night her friends are very brutally murdered, and nobody knows how they were murdered. It was very mysterious and suspicious circumstances. So basically what ends up happening is Bryce collaborates with this guy Hunt, who's actually an angel. He literally has like these big feathery wings. He's known as a fallen angel because he was one of these angels that tried to overthrow the Asteri, which are these beings that rule the whole planet that they live on. So now he is a slave to this archangel named Micah, who kind of runs what I would say is the police department of Crescent City. And so yeah, Bryce and Hunt end up collaborating to try to find out who killed her friends. Oh man, was this book a wild ride. This definitely started off the series with a bang. I do think that it's probably the best series starter that Sarah J. Maas has ever written. For one thing, there are a ton of different beings on this planet that it takes place on. I'm just gonna kind of read for you. So there's the 4 houses of Midgard. Midgard is the planet that this takes place on. So first we have the House of Earth and Blood, which is shifters, humans, witches, animals, and many others that are chosen by Luna. And I'm trying to remember who Luna is. Luna might be a goddess. I'm not sure. Then there's the House of Sky and Breath. That is the Malachim, which are angels, fae, elementals, sprites, and those who are blessed by Solus. Then there's the House of Many Waters, river spirits, mare, water beasts, nymphs, kelpies. And then finally we have the House of Flame and Shadow, which is the Daemonaki, which I think are demons, reapers, wraiths, vampires, draki, dragons, necromancers, and many wicked and unnamed things. So yeah, there is quite a bit of diversity going on in terms of like all the different kinds of creatures that we have going on in this world. I will say I do agree that the first 100 pages was a bit clunky to get through. I will say I was never bored at all throughout this book, but yeah, the first 100 pages with the world building was a bit clunky, but I also agree that the last 100 pages of this book was absolutely insane and incredible. Sarah J. Maas does that really well. Some of my absolute favorite books by her have that same thing going on where the last 100 pages are just absolutely crazy and then you can't wait to read the next book of the series. I really enjoyed Bryce and Hunt and the slow burn romance that they have going on. I know that a lot of people were disappointed that this is an adult fantasy book and there isn't a lot of smut going on, although I will say that in my opinion there was one scene that got pretty smutty that like nobody talks about, and I don't know, like I thought it was smutty, so, but I'm sure that the future books in this series are going to get a lot smuttier. Also, there is a minor character who is Lahaba. She is a fire sprite. I loved her character so much. She was just so cute and so funny. Added a lot to the story in my opinion, and I loved the friendship that she had with Bryce throughout the novel, because essentially her and Bryce work at this art gallery together. But yeah, I just like love her character so much. I'm really looking forward to seeing what Sarah J. Maas does with the story of this series going forward. Alright guys, that's going to be it for my end of August wrap up. I hope that you guys enjoyed. I would love it if you would leave a comment down below if you want to discuss any of the books that I brought up in this video. I would also love it if you would like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance if you do. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!